Good evening and welcome to this month's edition of the Watch Club, produced by the Newburyport Documentary Film Festival. I am Program Director James Sullivan. Thanks to all of you for being here. We are excited to speak with our guest tonight. Since we started this monthly interview series, I've been explaining it to people by saying it's like a book club, but we just ask you to watch a documentary and then come back and join us for a talk with the filmmaker. And so we have a special event tonight, which is that we're actually doing something like a book club. Tonight we have the author of a book called a great new book called Well Documented, the essential documentaries that prove the truth is more fascinating than fiction. Haydn Smith is a British film journalist with a long list of credits to his name, lots of books about film. And he is here with us tonight, and I'm very excited to talk to him about some of the great documentaries of all time. Hi, Ian. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, James. Lovely to be here with you, and hello, everyone.
So we've got a lot to talk about. Your book is extremely handsomely produced, among other things. It's a gorgeous book. And we were just saying before we got on camera that you must be pretty pleased about the layout of the thing, because obviously that's not your bailiwick. It was just to write the text, right?
Yes, the one thing that we sort of agreed on, myself and the publishers with the designer in advance, was we wanted this idea of a kind of torn from the headlines feel to the book. So it's something that sort of in some ways takes the form of an old-style newspaper, with sometimes the headlines are kind of really shouting out at you. But at the same time, it's dealing with films that obviously work on a much more subtle level than that in many cases.
Right.
But it was extremely good fun, actually. It surprised me. It was something that had actually been pitched to me by the publisher. Or one of the people at the publishers, and then they asked me to. They only had about 6 or 7 titles that they thought we could include, and then over the course of the next year, it really changed shape and took on different sort of concepts. And the publisher was always amenable to all the different ideas I had, although I feel that they became slightly exasperated at the number of documentaries I was throwing at them.
So I think you need to back up for a second. You're saying that the publisher wanted you to write about 6 or 7 documentaries?
They had an original list. It was going to be more than that. They originally had the idea, let's do 100 documentaries.
Yes.
And my thing, desperately trying to get more titles in, my original thing was, well, if this filmmaker, for instance, the British filmmaker Nick Broomfield made a documentary called The Selling the Serial Killer about Eileen Wuornos.
Right.
But then he followed it up 10 years later with The Life and Death of a Serial Killer. And I said, well, you can count these as 2, can't you? As one single title rather than 2. And they're like, well, that goes around the 100. So what we ended up doing is agreeing that we would focus for the main part on individual films, and there would be 100 of those. But with each of those films, I would pick 3 other films that had some link. They didn't necessarily have to be related by genre or by that filmmaker, but they would have some sort of tendentious link that we could include there. And the final concession is that I really wanted to include short films. So we have another 20 films that are under 40 minutes long that I feel over the course of the last century have been really wonderful short documentaries.
Right. So it's kind of like a recommended if you like feature, right? Like sort of if you're interested in this film, or you do watch it based on Ian's recommendation and find that you love it, here's 3 other or 4 other classic documentaries from, all kinds of, it's amazing. All kinds of
all over the world.
Yeah. So you're obviously extremely well versed in the entirety of film culture and film history. Was documentary something you kind of needed to bone up on a little bit? You covered a lot of stuff here. You watched a lot of documentaries that you could not have seen nearly all of these before you started working on this book, I would imagine.
I thank a few people at the back, and those people were experts in their own areas, and recommended some titles. I would say about 90% of the films that are in the book I'd previously seen at some point. Of the 300 other films and the 20 shorts, there are some that I've still only seen some clips of, and part of a recommendation is the list for me to go out and see them as well. And they tend to be the more obscure ones. All the shorts I've seen, but of the 300, there are a few there that are very, very difficult to see. But now the main body that I've written on, yes, I have seen all those,
Wow.
and
Right.
they're fun.
Yeah, of course. So I should say, before I forget, that those of you who are watching live right now, if you have a question for Ian at any point during the broadcast, just put it in the comments section, and we will try to get to it as we're talking. But so, Ian, we mentioned this before we came on the air. There's no way we're going to be able to cover even a fraction of the films tonight, anyway. But making a list is so much fun, because in part because it just, everybody has an idea. Everybody's an expert when you make a list of something, right? These are the 100 best of this genre, whatever it might be, and everybody has ideas of their own about what belongs and what doesn't belong, right? So
Yep.
I guess maybe my question about that is, to what extent did the list change in your mind, and was it changing right up until the final day when you sent the final manuscript into your publisher?
Yep. To start with the end bit, it changed up until about 3 days. I finally got around to seeing Peter Jackson's Get Back, the
Oh,
Beatles
right, sure.
documentary, and within 5 minutes of watching it, I had to go back to a drawing board and figure out how that was going to go in.
Right.
It was absolutely one of the films that I knew in 20, 30 years' time, people are still going to be talking about
Of
it.
course, yeah. Yeah.
So that was a tough one. With a lot of the others, there were the core ones that I knew would definitely be in there.
Yeah.
The canon, so to speak.
Yep.
But I also wanted to include other things. And one of the surprises for me that was in this original list that I'd been given was the September issue, R.J. Cutler's film about Vogue and Anna Wintour. And when I watched it again, it really surprised me how interesting. And it does something that fiction film doesn't do, that documentary can do so well. R.J. Cutler went in to make a documentary about Anna Wintour, and that film ends up really being about Grace Coddington, who works for her and is one of the chief stylists on the magazine. And I found that really interesting. And it takes me back, and I'm going to paraphrase Hitchcock here, but the famous Hitchcock line that when you're making a feature film, the director is God. When you're making a documentary, God is the director. You can't control everything. And they would have had no idea going into making that film that Grace Coddington would become the star of it.
Right.
And that gave me an in. That, not necessarily one of my favorite films amongst this list, but it's a fascinating example of what documentary can do. It can surprise the filmmaker.
I want to ask you a little bit about the films that have come out even since you obviously finished the manuscript. The short list of films that are going to be considered for the Academy Award for this year's documentary features is pretty incredible, as it usually is. I actually just wrote a piece about. I talked to Laura Poitras, who made All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, which, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, is fantastic. And obviously it just came out recently, so Ian can't include it in the book. It'll be in the next edition, probably, right? But my question about that is that her producer on that film also was a producer on How to Survive a Plague, which is in your book, which came out about 10 years ago, which is about the AIDS crisis and the ACT UP activists who sort of forced the U.S. government's hand towards actually addressing the AIDS crisis, and the fact that there was no medical research being done, or not enough medical research being done. And it very much fits in line with with All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, which is about the opioid crisis and the photographer Nan Golden's organization of protesters who clearly took a cue from the activists who are portrayed in How to Survive a Plague. So do you want to tell me a little bit about why this film is so powerful and made it into your list?
It's kind of interesting because as a format, How to Survive a Plague is not necessarily one of the documentaries that I might have necessarily rushed out to include, because it's talking heads, archive footage,
Yep.
And I hadn't seen it. I'm glad you picked this, because this is a
Mm.
very good example of a film that came out of a conversation I had with someone. I knew about ACT UP through a French fictional film that had been made a couple of years ago called 120 Beats Per Minute,
Mm-hmm.
which looked at the Paris wing of ACT UP. And it was brilliant. It was this discourse with what was going on at the time in the 1990s, and the anger and divisions that were taking place within these groups. So I went on my friend's recommendation to watch How to Survive a Plague, and I was stunned by the complexity of it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, how the director David France
Mm-hmm.
presented so many different arguments in such a cogent, cohesive way. And I thought this is a really great example of the Talking Heads archive footage film done at its very, very best.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, at the heart of it, the issue is incredibly important. And it's interesting, he's folded up now with How to Survive a Pandemic, which is a film I haven't yet seen,
Mm-hmm. Me neither. Right.
doing exactly the same thing, looking at
Mm.
the responses in that moment. But I think what's interesting with this, it deals with so many different things. It deals with politics, prejudice, the personal side of a wider movement, as well as that wide movement itself. And he does it incredibly articulately.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also ultimately because he was at the heart of this. David France was a member of ACT UP.
Mm-hmm.
He was campaigning with all these people. It's also a beautiful memorial to the people who have passed since. And I do think it's quite a remarkable film.
What would you say are so there's obviously so many touchstones covered in your book. I mean, there's so many nice surprises. There's definitely a handful of films that I haven't seen yet that I will now be sure to see, are now being added to my list because of their inclusion in your book. But what would you say are like sort of the small handful that, the fingers of one hand documentary examples through time that are, the most obvious choices, that are the most iconic
Yeah.
documentary films? What are they?
I would start. I know some people might go to 1922 and Robert Flaherty's Nanook of the North,
Right.
which is a great ethnographic documentary. But I would jump forward 7 years to 1929 and start with Ziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, which is a fantastic example of what was known then as Soviet constructivist filmmaking. Very simple idea with editing. Each shot has an individual meaning. If you take a shot with this meaning and a shot with that meaning and you put them together, you create a third meaning. That's essentially what these filmmakers tried to do in the 1920s. Ziga Vertov, Sergei Eisenstein, Pudovkin, many others. And this is a really fantastic example of that. It's a day in the life of a city. It's actually shot in 4 separate cities, but it's all put together from dawn till night. And it's quite an extraordinary piece of filmmaking, and it's very, very playful. And as you can see from the image on the screen, it uses some very simple optical effects, in-camera effects that are quite impressive. And it was actually Ziga Vertov's wife who edited the film as well, and does a marvelous job with it. I definitely say that's one.
So before you move on to the next one, let me ask you
Yeah.
quickly about this. Explain what the city symphonies were, because this is
Right. Yeah.
this is the classic
So
example of them. But there's several beautiful films, right?
yeah, there's quite a few. They're mostly around Europe.
Hmm.
Although I will say there was a 1914 film, I believe, called Manhattan,
Hmm.
which was about Manhattan becoming vertical.
Right.
But yeah, it was a series of films made in and around cities in Europe, predominantly in the 1920s.
Hmm.
So you had Berlin, a city symphony. You had a beautiful film called Rain, which was about a rainstorm over Amsterdam.
Hmm.
You had a number of films set in Paris, of different styles, and then you've got this film, and it's essentially a film in which the main character is the city
Right.
itself,
Right. Okay.
and normally set to music.
Right. Okay. So sorry to interrupt, but go ahead.
No, it's fine.
What do you feel is next on the list of, sort of like, if it, all documentary best ever film film lists.
Yeah,
What else appears?
I'm going to have to jump to 1975. I'm a big fan of the Maisel brothers.
Sure.
I mean, Give Me Shelter, their Rolling Stones film, is extraordinary and
Hmm.
provocative.
Hmm.
They made a film, well, Albert made a film with Robert Drew in 1960 called Primary, which was about one of the primary contests with John F. Kennedy, which is just a fantastic piece of filmmaking. And then the Maisels themselves in 68 made Salesman,
Salesman. Yep.
which is also in this book.
Hmm.
But I would have to go with Grey Gardens
Right.
because it's a crazy film. It's essentially relatives of the Kennedys, relatives of the
Jackie.
Bouviers,
Yeah.
Jackie Kennedy's or Jackie Onassis then
Right.
family. And the idea that originally Peter Beard, the famous photographer, and Jackie Kennedy's sister intended to make a film about this family of this mother and daughter.
Hmm.
That you can see Edie there, the daughter.
Hmm.
And they lived in this dilapidated house in a very, very lovely area on the East Coast. And the film was meant to be about essentially refurbishing the house,
Right.
which they did. But something didn't work and it all fell apart.
Hmm.
And the Maisels were hired to come in and film, and then they were sort of sacked. But Albert was just obsessed with the Beals, the two Edis, and so he decided to make his own film, which is what Grey Gardens ends up becoming.
Right.
That original film is now actually available to see. A Swedish director put all the footage together a couple of years ago, and it's
Really?
called That Summer. And That Summer is a beautiful film. I think it's 2019. It's a really gorgeous film. But this one is just, there's no story. There's no structure. It's just a series of scenes between mother and daughter, reminiscing over the past, fantasizing about the life that they lived or live now. There's a whole bunch of cats and other animals roaming around the house, and it's just captivating.
And we should say it's kind of an example of what I guess you might call shabby chic, right? I mean, like
Yep.
these two women who are from a wealthy family are, uh, a little bit eccentric, I guess we should say, and the house is extraordinarily run down. Um,
Yep.
so it's amazing that this thing got made, and I think that that's why it's lasted as long as it has in the consciousness of uh, what a great documentary is. I mean, it's amazing that they had this access,
Yep.
and that they had these women who wanted to be on camera, in spite of their, a lifestyle that most of us would have been, not exactly excited to be shown on have shown on camera. Yeah.
No, definitely. And I'd probably say it's as a companion piece to it, another film that I deal with in the book is called Portrait of Jason by Shirley Clark from 1967,
Hmm.
about this gay hustler living in San Francisco. And that is literally shot over the course of one night with one camera in a hotel room. I think it's Chelsea Hotel in New York.
Hmm.
And this guy talking to camera and being interviewed by Shirley Clark and the various people in the room. And again, it's a fascinating portrait, a snapshot of a moment in time that I think is quite extraordinary. Um,
Absolutely.
but if I'm moving on, I can't not talk about Steve James' Hoop Dreams
Right.
from 1994.
Hmm.
Following the lives of two black teenagers
Hmm.
as they get a scholarship to a private school to try out to be basketball players. It's heartbreaking, and it's absolutely fascinating. And again, an interesting follow-up to that. There's a documentary that's coming out very soon. I'll be interviewing the director in February with their film Subject, which is taking three subjects from documentaries made over the last 30 years and
Hmm.
interviewing them to see how that documentary impacted their lives.
Hmm.
And one of the boys, obviously now grown up, is one of the subjects in this film, which I've yet to see, but very
Wow.
much looking forward to it. But yes, Steve James's film, it was meant to be a 50-minute documentary. It ends up being 3 hours
Right.
and is an epic portrait of America in that period of time in the mid 1990s.
I can't remember in your book if you mentioned these two on the same page or not, through the recommending feature. But I know they're both Hoop Dreams and this one are covered in their own in different sections of the book. The
Yeah.
Up series, I think, is worth mentioning, right? I mean,
Yes.
and so I think that's better known in England for obvious reasons because it's made there, right? Than it is here. But lots of documentary film fans will know what it was. But do you want to explain briefly what that is? It's such a great idea, right?
Yeah, it basically it was in the 1960s. It was decided to follow a group of children around, and it was initially meant to be a one-off interview
Wow.
with a group of children from all different backgrounds in the UK. Ends up being 14. Apparently, they took a whole bunch of them to London Zoo one day and watched them interact, and found the 14 from that.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened then is that an executive turned to one of the producers who became the director, and Michael Apted, and said to him, "Wouldn't it be great to follow up on these?"
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is that they would see them every 7 years. And so it's 7 up becomes 14 up, becomes 21 up,
Mm-hmm.
and it's now at 63 up. And sadly, Michael Apted died in the last few years.
Right.
And I think a few of the people are thinking they'll do one more and get to 70, and that's it.
Wow. Right.
But it's extraordinary.
Right. I'm going to switch gears for a second and ask
Sure.
you something. Before we got ready to do this broadcast, our producer Steve and I asked you, Ian, for some of your materials so we could get a sense of behind the scenes. And I am fascinated by the apparent fact that you still work with pen and ink.
Yep.
Did you write this whole manuscript in
Yep.
your notebooks?
I didn't write the manuscript in my notebooks, but I was meticulous in making notes. I mean, this thing, the yellow legal pad is my best friend, and
right.
I start with that. So when I'm watching the film, the notes go down on there. Then I move them into my notebook, and I'm a little OCD. I use exactly the same notebook for every different project. So it's a different notebook, but it's the same make, the same type of notebook. And with that, I make the notes to the point where I'm starting to structure what I'm going to write. But the first time I actually start writing, I do that on a computer.
Yeah. Okay.
But it allows all those things to percolate in my head if I've written it down.
Sure. One of my books is based on a list of 100 as well. It's about protest songs.
Yep.
And so
it's a good book.
I sympathize and I understand completely. And the OCD is real, right? I mean, if you're going to be that kind of an, obsessive list maker, there's got to be some element of OCD in there, I think. So we're simpatico on that level, I think. We have a question from a viewer. Sharon is asking, what are two to three elements that you feel make a good documentary? Do you have any visceral reactions to particular choices documentarians make? I have some thoughts about this because we see certain choices being made again and again in recent documentary films. But the question is for you, not for me. So,
well, I'd love to hear what you have to say as well. But I do think that what you tend to find is that there are trends. Like there was a period in time when a few years ago when if you had talking heads on the screen, the camera would move slowly past them. That winds me up. I'm not a big fan of things that I feel are trends. I do feel sometimes the talking heads don't always work. A very good example of a filmmaker who's tried to buck against that, and other people have done this, but he does it very well. Asif Kapadia directed the Ayrton Senna documentary, Senna, the Formula One racer. The Amy Winehouse documentary, and more recently Maradona, about the Argentinian footballer. And what he does is brings together the voices of people, and he'll list who they are at the end and sometimes credit them on the screen, but you never see them. And what you have is a massive assemblage of really impressive archive documentary footage. I think that's a good way of not doing the cutting back and forth between the talking head and the archive footage. Sometimes you have to use the talking head.
Sure.
But I would say with a lot of the films that I include, my favorites tend to be ones that don't conform in any way to what a documentary is. Like another one that I should have included before Grey Gardens is Orson Welles' F for Fake, which is not a documentary, not a fiction film. not an essay film. It exists in its own universe. I have no idea exactly what it is, but it's wonderful. It's about his life. It's about the making of a film. It's about the art of illusion and magic. It's about lots of different things, and yet it seems to be about nothing at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of film that really draws me in.
Well, there's been, speaking of trends, over the last several years, there have been filmmakers who sort of seem to be maybe taking documentary filmmakers who seem to be maybe taking some cues from Wells in terms of that. I mean, we mentioned before we came on, we mentioned Robert Greene, who's
Oh,
made several great films,
brilliant.
and they're all of them seem to be about reenactments,
Yeah,
and the film itself is about the reenactment. So it's a historical event. Well,
yeah,
Procession is the most recent one, in which he visits with several victims of the Catholic Church sex scandal. These are grown men now who are
yeah,
still traumatized. And um, Green, the director, gets them to agree to go through a therapy process where they act out things that traumatize them as kids, and that's the film, right? So I mean, it's amazing that he and his other films are sort of like that too. So that sort of they're about history, but being told through the reenactment of history. So
yeah.
there's been a lot of playing with form. I mean, what's the Bloody Noses film?
Oh, Empty Pocket, Bloody Noses, Empty
Empty Pockets,
Pockets.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And there's one of the last films that I included in the book is a Mexican film by this really, really great young director. It's called A Cop Movie. It's on Netflix, and all I would say is watch it. It is it's one of the most difficult films that I had to describe,
Hmm.
just because it's fiction wrapped up in fact, wrapped up in a different kind of fiction,
Hmm.
and it's quite extraordinary.
I'm going to say one thing about, to go back to the question about that Sharon had about things that wind us up. In the last maybe 5 years or so, it seems like every documentary we've screened or looked at that were submitted to the Newburyport Documentary Film Festival has to include the obligatory multiple versions of drone shots, right? Just because drone technology is available now, every single film suddenly has an overhead aerial shot of the neighborhood. Which, I mean, in some cases it makes perfect sense, and in others it's just that because they had the drone
Yeah.
available to them. So anyway, um,
Oh yeah, I would say if you're going to use a drone shot, really know what you're doing. There was a film from 2019 called For Summer, which is a
yeah,
beautiful film
yeah,
essay, and it only has one kind of drone shot. It's a straight up vertical by the drone, and you need it because you need to understand just how devastated the city of Aleppo in
yeah,
Syria has become.
right.
But it's not used for any other thing,
Hmm.
and it works.
Exactly. Um, I think we're going to wrap up in a few minutes.
Yeah,
I should mention Asif, who you just mentioned with Senna and his other films, Maradona, the film about Maradona. He wrote the foreword to your book.
he did.
So yeah.
Yes. And I'm
Um,
actually currently working with him now, the British Film Institute in London.
mhm.
We're curating a 2 month retrospective of the films of Akira Kurosawa, the
Oh,
Japanese
wow.
director.
Right.
So, yeah, he's a great guy.
Um, so obviously anyone watching this broadcast is at least somewhat interested in documentary. But to me, I mean, I'm a journalist, you're a journalist. To me, it's an endlessly fascinating form. It's another form of journalism as far as I'm
Yep.
concerned. But there's been such an explosion with the democratization of the technology over the last 20, 25 years or so. And we just see an endless, there's classics that are mentioned in your book that sort of stand alone. But over the last 20 years, we've had just this incredible wealth of fantastic documentaries coming out. Is it just mostly in your mind, Ian, about the technology becoming so simple and that you can actually practically shoot
Yeah.
a phone, shoot a documentary on an iPhone now, or what it, or I mean, so many of the films are about social issues, which are obviously never-ending source of hot topic. What is it about the form that has exploded so much over the last 25 years or so?
I think it's the quality.
Mhm.
Is for me, that's the big difference. And I'm just going to use one final example from the book. David LaChapelle, the photographer who uses saturated colors, he made a film in the early 2000s called Rise,
Right.
which is about crumping and clowning in LA, two dance forms that are used to get kids off the streets. It's the perfect synthesis of socially minded filmmaking with entertainment, of actually finding a way to tell a story in a really unique format. And I think what's happened is that the technology, the availability of cheap technology, has allowed people who have good stories to tell to also make the films really, really well. In the past, I think I used to have a different idea when I went to documentary film festivals, in that I would always be going for the story, and if it's well made, that's a really good thing, but it might not be. Whereas if I see a fiction film, I'm expecting it to be well made.
Sure.
And this is the thing that I think is really, really changed. And yet I'm still surprised at the way that some technology works. There's a Netflix film, I believe it's called An American Murder, that I was tempted to include. And the entire film employs the police cam footage and any phone footage that had been taken about this missing family. I just thought it sounded like the most dreadful idea in the world. And when I finally saw the film, I was so stunned by how well it'd been put together. Again, yes, it's about technology, but it's still about, you've got to have the great idea. You've got to have a good story there. And you've got to be, as you said, a good journalist in investigating that.
Right. I'm going to give the last word to another viewer who's got a good question. So we'll end here. Jean asks this, or I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but it's a good one. So the documentaries that get public recognition are often the ones about famous people, places, i.e., Harry and Meghan. Let's say that right now. But her favorites, Jean's favorites, are about non-famous people and places that are uniquely interesting. I think that's absolutely a very important point. I mean, there are great documentaries about famous people and places, but the vast majority of good ones, and certainly the vast majority, I think, is safe to say, of the ones that you cover in your book, are about, Hale
Everyday
County is a
people.
great example, right? About regular people who you've never heard of before and may never hear from again, but they turn out to be great subjects for documentaries.
Absolutely. I couldn't. And you mentioned Hale County this evening, Ramel Ross's film. It's like a tone poem. It is it's a series of seemingly unconnected images of life in this county. This county, which in the 1930s was famous for being part of the Farm Securities Administration's subject of photos of poverty in Alabama. And it's an extraordinary piece of filmmaking. And I can't recommend it enough, but it is just about the fact that everyday lives are interesting. They don't have to be celebrities.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And we know that the truth is stranger than fiction, always, almost always, right? You can't make this stuff up. So, Ian, thanks so much, Ian Haydn Smith. Thanks so much for being with us. We could talk on, but we'll let everybody get on with their, and speaking of which, I was going to say, let everybody get on with their holiday plans. If you have a film lover on your list, here's a great idea for a fantastic idea for a holiday gift. Ian's book. So thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, James.
We'll look forward to seeing you all again in the Watch Club in January. Watch out for our announcement about that. And we'd like to thank our sponsors as always. We'll see you soon, and happy holidays.